When people think about what happens after a great war, they usually think about winners and losers. The winners take what they want, humiliate the defeated, draw new borders, and go home. That's the pattern. It's the pattern most of history follows, and almost every time it plays out that way, it plants the seeds of the next war. The humiliated come back. The resentment festers. The cycle repeats. But in 1814, something different happened. A group of diplomats gathered in Vienna and tried something almost no one had attempted before on that scale. They didn't just try to end a war. They tried to design a peace, a lasting one. A peace built not on punishment, but on balance. Not on revenge, but on stability. It didn't work perfectly. Nothing in history ever does. But the order they created held Europe together, largely without a general war, for nearly 100 years. That is not a small achievement. That is extraordinary. And almost nobody talks about it. This is the story of the Congress of Vienna. And once you understand what happened there, you will never look at international politics the same way again. To understand Vienna, you have to understand what came before it. Europe in 1814 was exhausted in a way that is hard to imagine today. For over 20 years, the continent had been in almost continuous war. The French Revolution had unleashed forces that no one knew how to contain: nationalism, mass armies, the idea that ordinary people could topple kings. And then Napoleon had taken those forces and weaponized them on a scale that left millions dead and the old order of Europe in ruins. By the time Napoleon abdicated in April 1814 and was sent to Elba, the map of Europe was unrecognizable. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 1,000 years, was gone. Napoleon had simply dissolved it in 1806. Ancient kingdoms had been erased and redrawn at his pleasure. His brothers sat on foreign thrones. Old dynasties had been humiliated, exiled, or extinguished. The continent was a shattered mosaic, and someone had to put it back together. The men who gathered in Vienna in September 1814 understood the weight of that task. Representatives came from virtually every state in Europe. Over 200 delegations in total. But the real decisions were made by a handful of men at the center of it all. And the most important of those men was an Austrian diplomat named Clemens von Metternich. Metternich was not a romantic figure. He was not a battlefield hero or a visionary revolutionary. He was something rarer and, in that particular moment, more valuable. A supremely skilled political realist. He believed with total conviction that the greatest danger facing Europe was not any single nation or ruler, but instability itself. Revolutions, nationalism, the idea that peoples could redraw borders based on shared identity. These things terrified him because he had seen where they led. He had watched Napoleon ride those forces to dominance, and he had watched them eventually consume him too. What Metternich wanted from Vienna was a system, not a punishment, not a monument to Austrian power, a system that would prevent any single nation from ever again becoming dominant enough to overturn the entire order. The concept he championed was the balance of power, the idea that the major states of Europe should be kept roughly equal in strength, so that any aggressor would immediately face a coalition strong enough to stop them. It sounds obvious in retrospect. It wasn't. It required the victorious powers, Austria, Britain, Prussia, and Russia, to restrain their own appetites. It required them to give France, the defeated enemy, a place at the table rather than grinding it into dust. That was the decision that defined the entire Congress. And it was not a natural or easy one. The man who made it possible on the French side was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. If Metternich was the architect of Vienna, Talleyrand was its most astonishing performer. He had served the French monarchy before the Revolution, then the Revolution itself, then Napoleon, and now he arrived in Vienna representing the restored Bourbon monarchy, a king that most of Europe had barely acknowledged. By any measure, France should have been in the weakest possible position. The loser, the aggressor, the country that had dragged Europe into a generation of war. Talleyrand turned that weakness into a card. He argued with elegant and maddening logic that France under the Bourbons was not the same France that had made war on Europe. Napoleon had been an aberration, a usurper. The legitimate France, monarchical, traditional, orderly, was itself a victim of the revolutionary chaos, just like everyone else. Therefore, France deserved to be treated not as a conquered enemy, but as a fellow member of the legitimate European order. It was audacious. It was largely fictional. And it worked. France was admitted to the inner negotiations and walked away from Vienna with its 1792 borders, essentially intact, losing almost nothing despite having lost the war. The Congress ran from September 1814 to June 1815, and it was not a solemn, efficient affair. Vienna during those months was a spectacle of balls, banquets, and theatrical entertainments, so lavish and continuous that one observer famously remarked that the Congress danced but did not move forward. The Austrian emperor spent an almost incomprehensible amount hosting delegations from across the continent. The social calendar was relentless, but the dancing was not decoration. It was diplomacy by another name. Relationships were built in ballrooms. Deals were floated over dinner. The informality was strategic. It created the atmosphere of shared, civilized identity that the negotiators needed to make compromises that would have been impossible in a purely formal setting. Underneath the waltzes, serious decisions were being made. Poland was divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The German states were reorganized into a loose German confederation of 39 states, replacing the dissolved Holy Roman Empire. The Netherlands were enlarged. Sweden received Norway. Switzerland was guaranteed neutrality. And crucially, France, despite everything, was restored to a position of legitimate standing in the European order, rather than being reduced to a vassal state. Then, in March 1815, the news arrived that stopped the Congress cold. Napoleon had escaped from Elba. He landed in southern France with a handful of soldiers and marched north. The troops sent to arrest him joined him instead. By the time he reached Paris, the king had fled, and the empire was restored. The Congress of Vienna, mid-negotiation, suddenly had to deal with the fact that the problem they were solving had just come back to life. The response was remarkable. The major powers immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw, not an enemy sovereign to be negotiated with, but a criminal against the peace of Europe, and mobilized against him. The unity forged in Vienna held. Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in June 1815, exiled permanently to St. Helena, and the Congress completed its work. The final act was signed just days after Waterloo. The crisis had, if anything, hardened the resolve of the powers to make the new order stick. The system they built is known to historians as the Concert of Europe. It was not a formal institution with a charter or a headquarters. It was a habit, a shared understanding among the major powers that when serious disputes arose, they would meet, negotiate, and find solutions that preserved the overall balance rather than resorting immediately to war. Through the rest of the 19th century, they did exactly that. Crises that in earlier centuries would have ignited general wars were resolved through congresses, conferences, and careful diplomacy. The Crimean War of the 1850s was the most serious exception, and even that remained limited. No general European war occurred for nearly 100 years after Vienna. That record has no parallel in modern European history before or since. So why did it eventually break down? Because the Congress of Vienna was built on a contradiction it could never fully resolve. It was designed to preserve stability and the existing order. But the existing order was increasingly at odds with the most powerful forces of the 19th century, nationalism and liberalism. People across Europe were beginning to demand not just stable governments, but their own governments, states defined by shared language, culture, and identity, rather than by the inheritance patterns of royal families. Metternich spent his entire career trying to suppress these forces. He used censorship, surveillance, and the suppression of political movements across Austria's vast empire. He saw nationalism as an existential threat, and he was right. It would eventually tear Austria-Hungary apart. But suppression is not a solution. It is a delay. The revolutions of 1848 swept across Europe and nearly destroyed the old order entirely. Metternich himself was forced to flee Vienna in disgrace. He had held the system together through sheer force of will for over 3 decades, but the underlying pressures had been building the entire time. By the second half of the 19th century, the concert was fraying. Germany unified under Prussian leadership in 1871 after a war with France that humiliated Paris and annexed the regions of Alsace and Lorraine. That humiliation did not go away. It accumulated. Meanwhile, the alliance systems that were supposed to maintain balance began to harden into rigid blocks. Each side committed to defend the other automatically, no matter what the triggering incident was. The flexibility that had made the Concert of Europe work gave way to mechanical commitments that no one fully controlled. In 1914, a single assassination in Sarajevo triggered those commitments like dominoes, and Europe plunged into the First World War. The 100 years of relative peace that Vienna had made possible ended in 4 years of industrialized slaughter that killed 17 million people and destroyed 4 empires. Everything the Congress had tried to prevent had happened anyway, just delayed by a century. And here is where it becomes something more than a history lesson. After the First World War, the victorious powers gathered at Versailles in 1919 to design a new peace. They did the opposite of Vienna. They humiliated Germany. They stripped it of territory, imposed crushing reparations, forced it to accept sole blame for the war, and excluded it from the negotiations entirely. They chose punishment over balance. 20 years later, Germany was back, and the Second World War killed over 70 million people. After the Second World War, the approach shifted again. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Germany rather than crushing it. Germany and France, enemies for centuries, were woven together into economic structures that made war between them functionally impossible. The European Union, for all its imperfections, is in many ways the inheritor of the Vienna idea, that lasting peace requires giving former enemies a stake in the system rather than a reason for revenge. The Congress of Vienna was not perfect. It ignored the aspirations of millions of people. It suppressed movements that deserved to be heard. It was designed by and for the powerful, with little consideration for the powerless. Those are real failures, and they contributed to the instability that eventually followed. But its core insight was correct. Sustainable international order requires that major powers restrain their own appetites for the sake of stability. It requires that defeated enemies be given a path back to legitimacy, rather than being permanently humiliated. It requires that the people designing the peace think not just about what they want to take, but about what kind of system they want to live in for the next 100 years. That insight is not complicated. It is not even controversial among people who study history seriously. And yet it is ignored again and again by powers who think that victory entitles them to take everything, that strength means never having to make concessions, that the rules of balance apply to others, but not to themselves. Metternich understood something that most leaders before and since have failed to grasp. Power used without restraint destroys the system that makes power meaningful. Napoleon proved it. The victors of Versailles proved it. The same lesson appears in every era, at every scale, in the rise and fall of institutions, companies, and individuals who mistake dominance for durability. The Congress of Vienna was a room full of men who had just survived a catastrophe and were wise enough, for one brief moment, to try to build something that would prevent the next one. They succeeded longer than anyone had any right to expect. The world they created was flawed and limited, but it held. And the fact that it held, for a century, through crises that in other eras would have ignited general wars, is the most underappreciated achievement in the history of diplomacy. History didn't stop after 1815. The questions Vienna tried to answer: how do you build a lasting peace? How do you restrain power without destroying it? How do you give the defeated a reason to cooperate rather than to seek revenge? These questions have never been resolved. They are being asked right now, in every conflict, in every negotiation, in every room where the future is being decided by people who may or may not have bothered to learn what happened in Vienna 200 years ago. If this made you think differently about how the world is put together, subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from,